I want to thank my friend Robert Kinsler, whose friend Scott suggested the idea for this video, and who forwarded a number of articles that helped create the basis for it. I have left links for those articles below. The Who and Led Zeppelin. Both are monumental bands that left an indelible mark on the classic rock era. While each band forged its own distinct path, there are two intriguing moments in history where their career paths intersected in ways that could have potentially altered their careers profoundly. And today we're going to talk about this. But first, if you like these types of videos and want to see more, please click like so the YouTube algorithm recognizes this channel. Let's first start by comparing these two iconic groups. The Who burst out onto the scene in 1965 with their debut album, My Generation, an album whose title track captured the essence of the tumultuous cultural shifts of the late 1960s. Led Zeppelin, on the other hand, emerged in 1969 as the decade drew to a close. But both bands would soar to unimaginable heights of popularity during the 70s. In an era where so many bands embraced a standard lineup of two guitars, bass, and drums, Led Zeppelin and The Who featured a lineup composing of one guitarist, a bassist, a drummer, and a lead singer. Both featured powerhouse drummers whose reputations behind their kits were as formidable as their reputations away from them. Both would feature vocalists with amazing charisma and almost unsurpassable power and range. Both would feature boundary-pushing guitarists who continually redefined what it meant to be a rock guitarist and what a rock song could be. And both would feature bass players with the ability to not only provide the bottom end, but also cover for the lack of a second rhythm guitarist. Both bands had a reputation for thunderous rock and roll, but also were very capable of transformative and artful rock as well. But one other thing these two bands had in common is how they both had intersecting moments in their respective histories that could have changed each band's sound and career paths completely. Let's first go back to 1965. The Who released their first album, My Generation, in December of 1965 in the UK. An altered version of this would be released in the US in April 1966 under the title The Who Sings My Generation. And even at this early stage, there were noticeable tensions between the band members, tensions that culminated in a confrontation between lead singer Roger Daltrey and drummer Keith Moon over Keith Moon's substance abuse issues. It was a confrontation that ended in Daltrey abruptly leaving the band, and for a couple of gigs, Pete Townshend would have to handle all of the lead vocals himself. In the audience at one of these Daltrey-free performances was a young 17-year-old pre-Led Zeppelin Robert Plant, still trying to make a name for himself in rock and roll. Seeing an opportunity, he approached Pete Townshend and offered his services as their next lead singer. In a 1990 interview, Pete Townshend recalled the situation. Plant came to see us 3 nights in a row and offered himself for the job, as did Steve Gibbons when he came to see us and Roger wasn't there. Obviously, none of them thought I was any good at singing. Reading this quote, it's hard to know if Townshend was being humorous, sarcastic, or offended. But as their single My Generation started climbing the charts, it was decided by both the band members and management that it was in everyone's best interest to make peace with each other and soldier on. But imagine for a moment if the band had embraced the idea of replacing Roger Daltrey with Robert Plant. A few years later, of course, Jimmy Page would discover Robert Plant, and as they say, the rest was history. When Jimmy Page first heard Robert Plant, his reaction was, when I auditioned him and heard him sing, I immediately thought there must be something wrong with him, personality-wise, or that he had to be impossible to work with because I just could not understand why, after he told me he'd been singing for a few years already, that he hadn't become a big name yet. But in 1966, when Robert Plant first offered his services to The Who, Led Zeppelin was still a few years in the future. Now, I have no way of knowing if at that time anyone in The Who had even heard a 17-year-old Robert Plant sing, and or how good he might have been at that point. But it's kind of fascinating to think how differently this band at such an early stage might have turned out if they'd taken up Robert Plant on his offer and continued with him instead. How would that have worked? And when you ask this question, you have to consider each band's creative dynamic. In Led Zeppelin, the songwriting credits are kind of all over the place. Jimmy Page, of course, being the single constant. This is probably due to him being the one who created the majority of riffs and musical ideas that would be crafted into their songs. But all the members of Led Zeppelin are listed as co-songwriters to varying degrees, with Robert Plant being the second most visible constant. And this is probably because he took the largest role in crafting lyrics and melody lines. On the other hand, while the other members of The Who did contribute songs from time to time, most of the creative output came from Pete Townshend, who was known for meticulously demoing songs before bringing them to the band, oftentimes having song structure, lyrics, and melodies already worked out well in advance. This is not to downplay the contributions of John Entwistle, Roger Daltrey, and Keith Moon. Even with Pete Townshend mapping out the songs in great detail, one need not look any further than the recently released Who's Next demo sessions from the anniversary box set to really hear just how much the other members brought to the plate and how much they elevated Pete Townshend's demos. So what would albums like Tommy or Who's Next have sounded like with Robert Plant on lead vocals? I'm sure there is someone out there on the internet with the know-how to create an AI-generated example of what Baba O'Reilly might have sounded like with Robert Plant on lead vocals, but I can't help but wonder, how much did Pete Townshend consciously or subconsciously write with Roger Daltrey's vocals in mind? And I have to think, would he have possibly written differently if it was Robert Plant providing the band's lead vocals? And that makes me wonder if albums like Tommy or Who's Next would have even happened with a different lead singer on board. At the end of the day, it's all just a game of what if, but it is a fun game of what if nonetheless. Of course, the next question is that if Robert Plant had joined The Who, what would have become of Led Zeppelin? And this brings us to our next historical intersection between these two bands. As I'm sure most Zeppelin fans know, Jimmy Page worked as a session guitarist and was a member of the Yardbirds prior to Led Zeppelin. During this time, Page also worked with multi-instrumentalist John Paul Jones, and in 1967, they agreed to work on their next project together. In 1968, Page invited Robert Plant and John Bonham to join this project, which started at first as the New Yardbirds, but would soon be better known as Led Zeppelin. But prior to all of this, and during Roger Daltrey's brief exit from The Who, Keith Moon reportedly cast about, looking to see what other work might be out there for him. Putting his name out there would later, and I should add after Daltrey's return, get him a recording session gig with Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. This session also included John Paul Jones and Nicky Hopkins. The session was for Beck's Bolero by Jeff Beck. In between takes, there was some discussion of the idea of the four of them forming a band together. And reportedly, this was when Keith Moon made the comment that such a band might go down like a Led Zeppelin. Now, I realize that this is not the only version of this story, and that some versions attribute this comment to John Entwistle. So I want to make it clear that I'm not saying this is the definitive version. I'm just saying that it is one version recounting how Led Zeppelin got their name. Different versions of this story have floated around over the decades, long before the internet. We may never know which one is the real one, but I digress. In this second intersection, we see the beginning of what might have been a very different version of Led Zeppelin, if it ended up even being called that. But I'll be honest and tell you that of these two possible what-if scenarios, I think the one where Robert Plant replaces Roger Daltrey had a higher likelihood of happening than the one where Keith Moon becomes the drummer for Led Zeppelin. I say this because when Robert Plant offered himself to be The Who's new singer, The Who, as a popular rock band, were still in their early stages. And for this reason, I think that the idea of changing lead singers would have felt a lot less riskier for everybody involved. If a change of band member was going to happen, I think it would have been more likely to happen at this time versus any other. And in this altered version of the band's history, their short time with Roger Daltrey would have just been remembered as a brief footnote in the band's history. Also, while having Robert Plant on lead vocals would have definitely changed the band's sound, I think they still could have been hugely successful, and I say this just because of the sheer strength of talent with each band member. Of course, that doesn't mean that Daltrey himself would have been a footnote, even in this alternate history. Roger Daltrey being such a powerhouse vocalist, I think there is every reason to believe that he might have found success either with a different band or as a solo artist. Whether or not he would have reached the same legendary heights as he did with The Who would be anyone's guess, though. Zeppelin's path, on the other hand, would have been completely altered without Robert Plant. And how much their trajectory would have been altered would depend a lot on who they found in place of him. In my experience, bands can be very fragile creatures, with the best of them being a blend of talent, chemistry, and luck. Change one component, and the band could move on to greater things or completely fall apart. So even if Jimmy Page had pursued putting a band together with Keith Moon, John Paul Jones, Nicky Hopkins, and hopefully Robert Plant, it would have been handicapped by Keith Moon's commitments to The Who, which is probably why Jimmy Page never pursued it and looked elsewhere for a drummer. Keith Moon's commitments to The Who would have resigned this version of Led Zeppelin to being probably nothing more than a one-off album project with maybe a possibility of a follow-up album at some undetermined time in the future. Again, it is fun to think just how different things might have ended up. But in the end, I'm glad that we got the bands that we got and that things worked out the way they did. In fact, as interesting as all this speculation is, the one alternate future I wish we had was the one where both Keith Moon and John Bonham had gotten some help in dealing with their personal demons and could have stayed with us longer. Those are my thoughts. What are yours? I'll be curious to know what you have to say in the comments. Again, if you like these videos, be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video. I want to give a big shout out to my Patreon supporters. Patreon supporters do receive exclusive weekly videos not available on this channel. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.